Hello and welcome to this edition of Our Future, Our Voice NI, leading the conversation for COP26. This is hosted by Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful. Today we're going to be looking at some of the perspectives of our younger people in Northern Ireland, what interests them in the climate emergency and what they're hoping to get out of the COP26 conference. And to talk about this, we have Fearon, who's a researcher, and we have Dakota Reid, who is an environmentalist. You're both very welcome to this edition of Our Future, Our Voice NI. I'm going to start off with you first, Sean. What is it that captivates you about the climate emergency, and what is it that really piques your interest?
Well, it's all-consuming in nature, and it is an existential threat to everything that we focus on in our politics and our society, and through multiple sort of generations. And the example I like to use here is that, look, you hear the phrase often when we're talking about economic terms, for example, look, there's no jobs on a dead planet. Everything in our politics is trivialized when we're talking about the collapse of the biosphere or the collapse of life supporting systems on Earth. Everything has to take a secondary nature, because all of those, political concerns mean nothing if there is, the sort of disaster that we're looking at current rates of warming or projected rates of warming. So, I mean, locally in our context, the example I like to use, and based recently on the IPCC's report from August there in 2021, was that, look, it's 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement or thereabouts in the north. In the next 20 years, we're expected to reach at least 1.5 degrees of warming by 2040 and locking in huge amounts of ecological catastrophe. So, imagine the amount of political importance and the political impacts that what's happened in the past 2 decades as a result of the institutions in the north and our local politics. Now, just put that in comparison to the ecological catastrophe that we're facing in the next 20.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. Dakota, what was it for you? What was it that got you, that gripped you and brought this to the center of your awareness?
Well, I've always sort of been interested in environmentalism, but I think for everyone sort of my age, I'm 22, and this is really personal because these are all effects I'm going to see within my lifetime if we don't take action really quickly. We're looking at possibly within my lifetime 90 centimeters of sea level rise in Belfast, and that's going to be, a catastrophe. That's going to cause a lot of flooding in a lot of residential areas, and these sorts of things are things that we could be seeing very soon, and things that we're already seeing very soon. The changes in weather, the changes in extreme weather events, higher temperature records, for several days in a row in July. It's all really terrifying. But I think, I've always cared deeply about the environment, particularly about biodiversity, and, knowing that the effect that this is going to have, my children and grandchildren growing up likely won't get to experience the environment in the same way that we do. And I mean, that's only the tip of the iceberg, because it's going to affect all parts of life, even if you're not, particularly connected to the environment. There is no escaping the effects of the climate crisis on, as Sean said, every area of society and politics is going to be affected. And it seems crazy not to be wanting to do something about that.
And Sean, you were picking up on a few things there about the all-encompassing nature of this problem, because the people we've been speaking to throughout this campaign. So we had, for example, with Dr. Sue Christie on a previous segment talking about the biodiversity crisis and talking about how this is so interlinked into everything else. Do you think that message gets through quite often, just about how, because, the example I always go with, where people talk about, for example, bees dying off, and people go, well, sure, who cares about that? But Sue was actually walking us through how some of the wider impacts of that. Do you think that message gets through?
I don't. I mean, that's an excellent point. And then even for how it manifests politically, like, look at what's happened, the far right shift in, say, European politics, for example, as a result of the refugee crisis in recent years. The scale of climate refugees we're looking at in the next 20, 30 years, for example, from the Sahel region or wherever it might be, will dwarf that. And that impact on our politics through Trump and Brexit and so on has been profound. Now, multiply it, that's just one element of a massively complex picture. And when it comes to political concerns for political parties, for example, often these issues are put as secondary to the climate crisis because, well, there's problems in health right now, there's problems in housing right now. Well, the solutions in policy terms for these crises are often solutions also to the climate crisis. So, for example, the housing crisis, building warm homes can massively reduce our carbon emissions while also eradicating fuel poverty and solving the housing crisis and that type of thing. So people need to look at them as if they're interlinked, but I think you're right, that message hasn't got across yet, that the climate crisis and climate policy in seats of government have to be completely interlinked and put at the precipice of what they're looking at.
What are your thoughts about that, about, particularly in the context of the biodiversity crisis and how kind of segmented, I don't know whether it's maybe just how we pay attention to these things, or maybe it's just a problem with the way policymakers view it, but in terms of how interlinked things like biodiversity is with wider issues.
Yeah, it's not appreciated enough. It's not appreciated in general society, and it's not appreciated enough in politics, how we're not just, one independent species who can live on this barren planet and it have no effect on our well-being. Absolutely not. That is not true at all. We are so connected to the rest of the ecosystem and so reliant on it. And I think pollinators are a really good point. And I think a lot of what we see about pollinators just fail to grasp how reliant we are on them, fail to grasp that, these declines in bees, they can't be made up for just by using honeybees as basically an agricultural animal. That won't do. You have to be actually saving our native species, and it's not even just bees, it's moths and hoverflies and everything like that as well. So to just, even there's not even the beginning of the understanding that we need about how the ecosystem is this web of life, and you can't just, pick holes in it in one place by using, pesticides and insecticides to a detrimental degree, because firstly, it doesn't really work because pest species will just develop a resistance to it. And secondly, you're killing off the things that we need to create this healthy ecosystem that we can live in as well. And the declines that we're seeing in our native bee species, in moths and in other species that are absolutely vital to our pollination, it's us that are going to be affected by this. And, the honeybee, there's a lot of talk about saving honeybees and everything like this. And especially in America and Australia, where the honeybee isn't even native. And even here, where the honeybee is native, it's only pollinating about a third of our key crops. So we need to be looking at this all holistically. And it's not happening. And I think a large part of that is to do with education. People don't get educated on all of these aspects of ecology, of the environment, of climate change. People aren't educated enough on climate change in schools at the moment. I wasn't given as much of an education in how important climate change is, to be honest. And I don't think, generations coming after me have that holistic understanding of the climate and the ecosystem and how important these things are, and how, we absolutely rely on them. And certainly I don't think politicians really recognize that either. And if they did, I think we would see a lot more action on issues such as insect declines, because it doesn't matter if, I personally, I'm an entomology nerd. I absolutely love bugs. I think they're fascinating. But even if you don't, and I recognize that most people don't, we absolutely need them. And if you appreciate the birds and the mammals higher up the food chain, you need to appreciate the insects, the other invertebrates, even things that you find kind of repulsive, like spiders or whatever that people generally don't like. I do like them. We need to appreciate them because they're all part of a greater web, and we need them all, everything to be working in harmony if we're going to have a future on this planet.
Okay. Sean, just on something that Dakota's been talking about there, environmental education, I was fascinated to learn last week, Taiwan mandates environmental education in their schools to teach their, Dakota's experience would be the same as my own. I wonder about yours, like the environment, apart from a couple of trips to, maybe a Delamont or somewhere like that, that was basically as good as it got in terms of learning about the environment. What do you think about mandating environmental education within the curriculum?
Of course, look, it's not something I'm an expert in, but anything that increases awareness, especially at a young age, and not just of what people understand as the environment and recycling and litter. And of course, that is absolutely important. We're talking about the climate and the life-giving processes on Earth, and an understanding of those and how they're all interlinked, and how, say, the tipping point at one might impact another. I think just those sort of headline points are incredibly important to know, I think, for everyone in society, and particularly at a young age. And there's questions about, look, it's an intimidating subject for more than one reason. First of all, it's expansive in its nature, and second of all, it is scary given the sort of changes that we're looking at on Earth. But an awareness doesn't have to be going into all the sort of the negative outcomes of that for children particularly, but an awareness of their role within the global ecosystem, our economy as part of a global ecosystem, given the resources that we use, that type of thing. Seeing our place as embedded within the Earth and not above it and dominating it, I think, is critical, and just getting those principles across.
Yeah, and just interestingly about, how we convey these and how we put that behavior change. Dakota, you were already talking about that. What for you are you seeing out there in terms of some of the positive aspects? Because Sean's right, this can seem like a bit of an intimidating topic. Just one of the things when I think about the climate emergency is a sense of feeling a bit overwhelmed, just a sense of what can we do? You hear these statistics out there. Positives. What is it that you're seeing from people out there in your experience?
I think just seeing people take action and demanding change is very positive. We know there have been recent surveys and recent studies into climate anxiety, particularly in young people, and it is really serious. And as you say, this is a massive, massive risk to humanity. Of course, it feels overwhelming sometimes, but seeing people come together in groups, and especially people my own sort of age, doing this of their own accord, setting up groups where they're seeing that there isn't a group set up that they think that they can act with, that is really positive. Seeing people just make that change for themselves. And whether it's, young people calling for legislation such as the climate bill up in Stormont at the moment, people being active on that and actually reaching out to their politicians on that, including a lot of people my own age who maybe don't usually, email their MLAs, maybe haven't done it before. That's really positive to see. And people demanding changes like more learning in and about nature, which is something that I've been campaigning on recently, because it's important for not just improving environmental education, but also for mental health and well-being, actually getting to spend time outside, because of course a lot of children grow up in environments where they don't get that sort of connection with nature at home because of where they live. A lot of sort of more deprived areas, kids growing up in poverty may not have these green spaces on their doorstep. So, seeing people actually stand up and say, I wasn't happy with my experience in education. I want to see a change where it's more embedded in education, that we get these benefits of being connected to the environment. Things like that are really positive. I think people taking action is the one most positive thing that, can sort of counter climate anxiety, which is a real problem.
Sean, just following on from what Dakota is saying there, what positives are you seeing with behavior change and people taking this issue seriously? Are you seeing any increased activism? Are you seeing any increased kind of pressure on policymakers and increase in campaigns?
I think so. There's certainly an increase in grassroots awareness of this and mobilization. And we're talking here about COP26, for example. COP21 was a flashpoint culturally and politically to mobilize people. You saw an offshoot of school strikes, for example, the divestment campaigns, that type of stuff. So look, there is a growing awareness, I think, about this on the ground. Certainly for grassroots activists, they've been around long enough to see increases in support and so on, and any amount of different sort of community networks and that being involved in their local, against anti-mining and that sort of stuff. But where this matters in seats of government and seats of power, for example, I don't think the message has hit home. I think they understand increasingly that this is an urgent and dramatic crisis, but that does not mean that it's going to overtake all the issues of the day, so to speak, in politics. And that's where the impact hasn't been felt yet. To put the climate crisis at the front and center of local, national, and international politics.
Okay, and the conference, of course, is fast approaching. Most powerful people in the world are going to be in a conference centre in Glasgow. and they're going to be spending time. We have been here before. Copenhagen was seen as a bit of a damn squib in 2009. Paris was seen to be a bit better in 2015, but still a lot more work to do. Dakota, what are you hoping to see from it? So what would you hope that day the final gavel comes down on it, what would you be hoping to see in the weeks, months and years after COP26?
Well, I'd like to see real commitments that are going to be followed through on, that actually will get countries to deliver on their Paris Agreement pledges, because it was reported recently in the news that only one country in the world, the Gambia in West Africa, is actually on track to deliver on its Paris Agreement pledges, which is really horrifying, because we really need to be meeting those targets if we're actually going to prevent the catastrophe that would unfold with the climate crisis, because a lot of things are going to sort of be like runaway climate change if we don't limit warming and really take action very quickly. So I'd like to see real commitments to that. I don't have an awful lot of positivity that this is going to be like a game-changing moment, that in the course of the sort of, is it 10 days or a week that COP26 takes place, that we're going to see some sort of transformational change. I know that's not really going to happen, because it hasn't really happened before, but if we could see more focus on a lot of the issues and better media coverage of all of the issues, it does make a difference, to see so much focus on this conference and so much focus on the run up to it, that we're having more conversations about this, that the BBC has a section now on climate change news, these sorts of things. We're moving in the right direction, but we really, really need targets in law that have to be followed through on. But I think we need more conversations. I want to see at COP more conversations about things like nature-based solutions. I want to see more conversations about how it's not just a climate crisis, it's also a biodiversity crisis, and those two things are interlinked. I want to see more focus on that, and I want to see them talking about climate change as something that needs to be integrated into all aspects of political decision making. It can't just be something that you give to one minister and then don't really, talk about at the actual cabinet table as something that interlinks with all the other issues. We need to be making this the sort of central thing that we're focusing on, that intersects with all departments. And I don't really think we've seen enough of that to date, but maybe we'll see more of that after COP26. It is given such a high profile, this event that's coming up, and that's optimistic, to see the media really treating this as a very, very important conference. But if we'll actually see changes, if, in the cold hard light of day, governments are actually going to be changing things, making decisions, not saying, one day COP26 climate's really important, and then the next day agreeing to some sort of new fossil fuel development. I'd like to think that we're going to see some change around that sort of behavior, but I'm not very optimistic.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Sean, what are you hoping to see in the weeks and months after COP26? What's your aspirations for this conference?
I would have an outlook very similar to Dakota's, and not to put a pessimistic view in this. Look, it is realist, because a lot of these global conferences can actually have the opposite effect politically of what they intend to do. So, for example, in 2015, the nationally determined contributions that all of these countries said that they would do to reduce their emissions by X, Y, Z, all of those amounted to something that wasn't sufficient to actually achieve the target that they said, 1.5 degrees by 2050. So they can actually be a massive exercise in greenwashing, and allowing countries to get off the hook by, and for your average Joe and Jane walking around the street saying, look, great, a big conference, the governments have come together, they've met, it's another big agreement, they've got it under control. And there certainly will be a lot of well-meaning press and stuff coming out of COP26. But the climate crisis we're looking at today isn't the same crisis of 20, 10, or even 5 years ago. We're talking about exponential increases in material usage of, carbon emissions and so on. So this is the crisis of today, and I think that needs to be recognized, that this is extremely urgent. It can't just be another well-meaning sort of get together with contributions that people say that they'll make and achieve, and then don't. So, I mean, your last question was about sort of grassroots activism and so on. That also needs to be essential here to make sure that coming out of this, locally and nationally, there are legally binding carbon targets and other ecological targets that must be met, and sort of 5-yearly plans to be able to achieve those targets. That's what we need. We need strict climate legislation coming out of this that doesn't allow governments and policymakers to get off the hook, and then you have no option but to make this front and center of your politics.
Okay, thank you very much. Dakota and Sean, you've given us a whole lot of food for thought here, and hopefully this conversation expands and continues, not just in the lead up to the conference, but it is something, you're right, that we all need to be talking about and thinking about, and also innovating on as well. Really appreciate you giving your thoughts and your time today. So that has been Sean Fearon and Dakota Reid. Thank you very much for your time. If you want to engage with anything that Sean and Dakota have said, you can do so in the comments section below, or you can tweet us. Make sure you use the hashtag #OurFutureOurVoiceNI. Thank you for watching.